Interacting with third-party services can be difficult. On one hand, debugging the communication between your app and the service can be frustrating. And on the other, tracking sessions while sharing private information at the same time can be problematic. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can take advantage of the Fetch plugin to capture and analyze both the payload of the request and response that you send, while at the same time keeping that information saved while being transferred. So let's go. For this example, I'm going to use a basic application I created that will use an API to find activities based on participants, and price range. I also have the phone number here, but it's optional, it's not really used. Whenever I click on the button, you see I get a different activity, like have a bonfire with your close friends or whatever. So the problem here is that if I select a cheap activity, it will work. It will give me something to do. But however, if I click on the free option and then I ask it for a different activity, it will give me an error. This is not a JavaScript error, but I'm getting an error from the API. This is an external API, so I don't have a way to debug the API. I need to understand what I'm sending to the API for it to fail. However, by default, the tracker is not gonna give me that information. However, since you can see here, I'm using the fetch function to perform the request. So I can take advantage of the fetch plugin that can be installed on top of the tracker to also track the request and the response information. I will install it with a simple line. As you can see here, I already have the tracker set up with the project key, the disable secure mode, so that I can test it locally. Remember that if you don't use the secure mode, you will some of the CSS that you use might not get recorded into the replay. And I'm also overriding the ingest point. If you're using a self-hosted version of OpenReplay, you will have to also set the ingest point. Otherwise, if you're using the SaaS version, you can avoid adding that flag. Now I'm just going to import the plugin from OpenReplay/tracker fetch, and to use it, I'm going to call the use method for the tracker, and I'm going to call the function that I imported from the plugin, and I'm just going to give it one single flag, which is the override global, so that it will override all instances of the fetch function wherever they can be found on my code. That way I don't have to manually override whatever function I want to use. If I don't want to do that, I can take the return value of the use method here, which in this case will be a wrapper function around the fetch function, so that only by using the wrapper your requests and response get tracked. In our case, we're going with the simple version and just overriding everything. Now if we test it again, just using it normally and generating a few requests that fail, and then waiting a few minutes until the replay is shown. Now if I replay my session, I have on the lower right section of the screen a new tab called Fetch, which is where I'm going to be seeing my request data, specifically the one that is originated with the fetch function. If I click on each of these lines, I will get the detail for each individual request, including, as you can see, the headers, the response I get back, which is the error I get from the API in this case, and also the URL I'm using. And if we look at the URL, we're going to see that while the minimum price is set correctly, the max price is set to undefined. And this is probably the reason why we're getting the error from the API. The phone number is there, but again, it's not being used by the API, so we don't get that much at the moment. But the max price seems to be the culprit of the error. So I can go back to the code, locate the code that creates the URL, which in my case, as you can see, you're doing a split by an underscore, and the free version doesn't have an underscore and a second value as part of the value. So this is why I'm getting an undefined. It's a silly mistake, but it can happen. And thanks to the plugin and thanks to we inspecting our users' requests, we get to see what the deal is. Now, if I update the application test again, I can see that I'm actually getting valid free activities. So that's a win. We've fixed the application. But what happens now if you use the phone number? Look at what happens when I use the phone number as part of the request. And the session gets tracked correctly. Everything works as expected. But if we go back to the session recording and look at what actually gets recorded as part of the fetch information, you'll see that within the fetch tab, the information of the request is also recording the phone number and sanitized. If we look at the replay, you'll see that the field is actually sanitized. You don't see the actual number that I entered when I used the application. But if you look at the fetch request, it is unsanitized by default. Because by default, while the tracker can ascertain that you're writing a long number, which potentially is a phone number, so it can decide to sanitize automatically, on the fetch request information, we can't really make that decision. So we have to manually sanitize it ourselves, and I'm going to show you how you can do that. You're going to add a new property to the configuration options that you passed to the plugin. This is the sanitizer option, which is a function that receives a request response data object that contains everything that you need: the URL, the request information, and the response as well. In our case, we're just going to affect the URL that gets recorded. So we're just going to be using the data.url attribute. To solve the problem, which is sanitizing the phone number attribute, we're just going to do it with a basic regular expression that will look for the phone number attribute and a number following it, and it will replace it with the phone number attribute again, simply followed by a number of X characters. And with that, we have our request URL sanitized. If we go back to the application, use it, and check out the replay again, we'll see that the data got sanitized properly. But what if that is not enough? What if we also want to sanitize the response that we get from the server, because the server might be sending us some sensitive information about our users. Let's assume here that the key attribute from the response, it's sensitive data, and we also want to sanitize it. We can go back to our sanitizer function and simply affect the response property of our request response object that we received as a single attribute of the sanitizer. Then we just do .body.key, and we'll immediately be able to replace the value of the response with whatever we want. And if we go back, test the application, and check out the replay, we'll see that as part of the fetch data inside the fetch tab, the response is also being sanitized accordingly. And that's it. The app is working and the data is being safely tracked. So remember, if you're using fetch for your network requests, then you can use the fetch plugin to track that information. If you're using Axios instead, we also have a plugin for that, so check our documentation. The data being tracked is not automatically sanitized, but you can easily do so with a custom function that acts as a sanitizer. You can influence both the request and the response data that gets tracked, so you can sanitize everything you need from there. If you have any issues installing the plugin or using it in your system, reach out to us on our Slack channel with the link in the description, and we'll be more than happy to help you. Until then, catch you in the next one.